So, welcome to another episode of our podcast, and we're calling it God's Abundance podcast here. And it's interesting. We have Professor, the Reverend Dr. Leanna Fuller from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary here with us. She was one of my reader for my Demon program, and she's just very well respected. And I love her books. And so when I learned she has this new book coming out, I'm like, great, I need to reach out to her and see if she will come and talk with us because the material she talks about, they're all so relevant. And for people who works in ministry, I almost feel like they're all must read. And one more step to that, it's like when I was reading some of the new material, I was thinking in terms of it can be applied to all kinds of relationship. And it's not your contact is more, yeah, we're talking about ministry, but I can see anyone using the book for small groups and all that. So I'm really excited. In fact, as soon as I get started, I text her, oh my God, I can't put it down. And I don't have time. And I said, I'm gonna probably suggest this to my book club because I think church is one thing, but like more deep down, it's like it touched a lot of a lot of my thoughts about reconciliation. So welcome, Leanna. Like I say, she is a professor in Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. The actual title would be Joan Marshall, Associate Professor of Pastoral Care. And we got to put some, like, thing about Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I'm grateful for the staff there because I truly have enjoyed my process there. And Leanna, she has a PhD in religion, psychology, and culture from Vanderbilt University. Did I get that right, Leanna?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. And so all her material is dealing with conflict resolution, conflict management. And actually, that's what this book is all about,
That's
embodied reconciliation. So super excited to have her here. She has also both parish and academic experiences and chaplaincy. So I think she just comes with a lot of backgrounds and I'm just super excited she is here with us today. As that we don't really deal with, conflict, right, Sean? In
We not
ministry,
at all.
no, not at all, not at all. But anyway, great to have you here. So I want to get started out. It's like, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, first I want to say thank you both to you, Sean and Francis, for inviting me today. This is exciting for me. I think it's probably the first time I've ever been on a podcast with visuals, so this is an interesting experience for me. What really inspired me to write this book is in some ways what inspired me to write my first book. And that was my own experience as a pastor on a pastoral staff dealing with a really intense conflict in my congregation. And when that happened, I just felt like I and the other pastor that I worked with, we just weren't very well equipped to know how to handle that conflict. And that's really what led me back to graduate school because I thought the church needs more resources, the church needs more tools for how to work with these kind of conflicts when they come up in our communities. And as everyone knows, conflict is a very, very typical thing to happen, not just in churches, but in any organization. And that's because they're made up of humans. And we're going to have differences, and that's going to lead to conflict at times. And my personal view is that conflict itself is not bad. It's just the way that we handle it can be more helpful or more destructive. So that's really kind of the outlook that I take with this. So my first book, which was called When Christ's Body is Broken, was really kind of using my own congregation and another congregation that I studied as case studies about how conflict sort of develops, what are its origins, what are its dynamics, how are group identities involved, and things like that. And it ended with some suggestions toward practice, but it was really more about kind of conflict itself and how to kind of cope with it more helpfully or more constructively. Over the last few years since that book was published, I started thinking a lot more about what happens in congregations after there's been a period of intense conflict or disagreement or even just tension, around particular issues or decisions. And as I started exploring that idea, I realized that there's a lot of literature out there about conflict management, conflict resolution, leadership through conflict, that kind of thing, lots of that kind of stuff. But there's really not much that I could find that was about how to heal or cope with the aftermath of conflict, if you want to put it that way. Um, so when I had an opportunity for a sabbatical, I started diving into this idea and I was really thinking about it through the lens of reconciliation. And there's a lot of stuff about reconciliation out there, so I had to narrow my focus a lot. And what I ended up feeling like I was called to write was not like really an academic treatise on reconciliation, because there are a lot of people who have actually written those kinds of books. What I felt like I was being called to do was to write something for faith communities and their leaders about communal practices for healing and reconciling with each other after there's been a period of conflict or tension. Because that was the thing that I felt like was kind of missing, in my own research, and that it was hard for me to find in other places. And so, again, I was in this position of saying, I feel like the church needs some more resources and some more tools. So I wrote this book really with those ideas in mind of proposing a set of communal practices that communities can use when they're facing something like this in their shared life.
Yeah.
Now that you're talking, I'm like, where was this book when I was serving at church? Because I was at a church that had something go on 10 years past that was intense
Yeah,
conflict, and it
right,
and they weren't talking about it, but yet it was
right.
still there was still an undercurrent of that we can't do that. It was they're kind of paralyzed. We can't move forward of this because something 10 years ago happened. I'm like, nobody from that era is still really around except for people who
Right.
remember it, and they can't
Yeah.
figure out how to go past it, let alone name that is the conflict.
Yeah. I think that's a really common experience in congregations, and not just congregations, but really organizations of all kinds. That many times the dynamics of a conflict, if they have not sort of been properly dealt with and talked about, um, even years later, even when some of the people who were most involved in it aren't even there anymore, it's almost like it continues to exert an effect that has
Yeah.
power beyond the moment. And I really feel like it's because people haven't done that work of, and these are the things I talk about in the book, telling the truth about what happened, naming their loss and grief, confessing of their own part in what happened, repenting of the ways they might have harmed each other, and then trying to bless each other and move forward into a new future together, or maybe release relationships depending on what has happened. And I think what happens in churches a lot of times when there is a really intense conflict is people just skip to the releasing, right? They just leave.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do it angrily, sometimes they just kind of fade away or disappear, but there's never the opportunity for people to really talk about what happened. And I do think that is because people have a real discomfort around talking about things like that in general. But also, I mean, as you're saying, Sean, especially when something's been over with, over with, quote unquote, for a long time, people feel like, oh, we shouldn't be dredging up the past. We shouldn't be bringing all this stuff forward because it's gone, it's done. But the thing is, it isn't done.
Yeah.
It continues to exert power. So, if it is actually in the past and nobody's really worried about it or concerned about it, that's fine. But I think if it is still affecting people's relationships in the community, there's a case to be made that talking about it, trying to process it some more could really be helpful.
Because oftentimes it feels like there's an albatross around a weight around our necks, even though it isn't really affecting the day to day, but you feel that,
Right.
and it's like, how do we deal with that? And so that's really helpful.
Absolutely.
Is how do we identify? Because a lot of us always talk about, well, this happened during that pastor's era, or that happened
Mm,
like, and they remember it, whether it's conflict or whatever. They're like, but that was then, and
right.
so, but yeah, it's as difficult to deal with our inner issues.
For sure. Yeah.
And the power too, the power of
Mhm.
the past. Even this whole group of people may all be new, but whenever something comes, it almost like it's quickly escalate into, oh yeah, remember and it's like, wait, you weren't there. Why are you
Right.
talking about this, right? And it's
Right.
like somehow people just bring it into and as if they have personally experienced that, even though they
Yeah.
have not. But like it's so
Right.
deeply ingrained and it becomes
Mhm.
part of the DNA. And so how
That's
do you
right.
tango, right? Like how people
Mhm.
really try to kind of, hey, no, 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 we're looking for a new chapter. And so
Mhm.
that's what I love when you said in the book that reconciliation is a process. It's
Mhm.
not really an end result. It
Right.
almost like we kind of need to, from time to time, need to think about it. And one thing that I didn't have a whole lot of time, so I confess. So I really tried quickly to glance through it, but I'm excited to really dive into it. When you say reconciliation, it does not equate to restoration.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes we think of the or as if the end result of reconciliation should be restoration, that everything
Right.
should go back to what it used to be. And
Exactly.
and I love why you make us think. It's like, no, because
Mhm.
it'll have to be something new. And that's
That's
where
right.
I resonate so much, even in personal relationship with each other, right? The
Mhm.
brokenness. Sometimes we talk about forgiving, and you quoted Desmond Tutu and
Mhm.
and his daughter. And so some of that I was like, oh, this is so applicable. And I almost hope that I would have like wanted to say, Leanna, don't just frame this as a church context. This can be so used by individual. But I know, I think so that gets back to, you are seeing the audience as
Mhm.
primarily
Mhm.
probably people in ministry, congregation, and all that. But I'm just telling you, after first couple chapters, I'm like, oh no, no, this is like a really great book for just broken relationship and how do we deal with some of that? Because naming it is so important. And
Yes.
oftentimes we don't even know how to name it correctly.
Yes, yes. I
Yeah.
mean, I do think that is a thing that we all struggle with in our individual relationships and in our communities, right? I was just the other day at Panera eating lunch and I just happened to overhear a conversation. I really wasn't trying to listen, but there were two women just across the aisle from me and they were having this very intense conversation and I realized they were two friends and one of them was telling her friend how much something had hurt her that her friend had done. And I thought, oh my goodness, like I wanted to go over to them and be like, this is really important good work that you're doing, like
Yeah.
being honest about how you've each been hurt and everything and how you want each other to be honest and tell the truth. Of course, I didn't do that because I was a complete stranger, but I think
I
that is the
actually
kind of
wish you
work that's
had
so
done it.
hard.
I actually wish you had done it. You guys walk over. My name's Leanna, and I actually teach this at a doctoral level. And I was like, wow, that would be a really awesome case
Yeah.
study. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought like that is the type of conversation that is so hard to have, even with people that we're the closest to, you know. And
Yeah.
so, needless to say, in churches where people are often very close, but they don't spend the kind of time together usually that, we spend with our spouses or friends, for example, it can just be really hard to do this truth-telling work and to name, you know, the feelings that we have around these things. I think sometimes in churches and other organizations, we're very task oriented. It's like, we have a thing that we need to do and we have plans that we need to make and decisions and things like that. And those are all, good things and important things. But I think when we're too focused on task, we lose sight of process and relational process in particular. And I think that's where sometimes things go awry because everybody's looking at the things we need to do and we don't slow down and say, okay, wait a minute, where might things have gone wrong between us? How are people feeling about this? What's the sense of the group about, this? It's really kind of the work of discernment in a lot of ways, which takes slowing down. Really good discernment takes time.
Right.
And in modern life, I feel like most people feel like that's what we don't have. So I think there's a case to be made for maybe doing some things more slowly or building in some processes where people can practice these skills,
Yeah.
of talking about how
Yeah.
things are affecting them and things like that.
I
Yeah,
think
naturally I'm conflict adverse, so I try to avoid conflict, but I've learned that I can't necessarily do that. But then
Right.
when we engage in that conflict, I'm like, oh, I don't want to re-engage it, so I avoid that person as best as
Right.
I can. And especially in the polarized world that we live in right now, it's like this book
Yeah,
is a perfect time. Not only do we have issues from the past, but
sure.
with this polarization of society right now,
Yeah,
how do we restore these relationships when we disagree politically, socially,
right.
issue wise? So I think this is a
Mhm.
great topic at this time that
Yeah.
really people can engage.
It does feel that way. I mean, one of the things I do talk about in the truth telling chapter is I do talk about first telling the truth about what happened. So if there's been an actual conflict or disagreement, but I also talk about a different kind of truth telling, which is truth telling about difference. And I think that's the kind of thing that you're really motioning to, Sean. Like, what are the differences that really do exist between us? Because I do think, again, in the church and lots of other places too, we like to emphasize the ways we're the same. That we have
Yeah,
this unity and we all believe the same thing and things like that. But the truth is, most groups are not as homogeneous as they seem. Even in a group that may share a lot of characteristics like maybe race, socioeconomic status, um, even ethnic background, language, all those things, um, there's often a lot more diversity in that group than you would see at first glance. And I think that is what is problematic sometimes for people in congregations. There's an assumption of sameness. Like we all go to this church, we're all part of this denomination, we're all Christian, we all affirm kind of these basic, tenets of our faith. That's all great. But the fact is, most people in that group are going to have differences of opinion about political issues, about social things going on in their community, even about things like what should be the priorities of the church. There's going to be differences there. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't just name that very clearly and find ways for people. The way I talk about it in the book is surfacing difference. Like, how can we practice bringing the differences to the surface? Not for the purpose of creating controversy or like dividing people, but just helping people have an awareness that, hey, we're all coming from different places, we're from different backgrounds, we grew up in different types of families. And so we're going to look at things from different perspectives. And I think it's actually better to do that kind of work, to practice those skills in a time of relative calm, when you're not in a high stakes situation where a
so
big
true.
decision needs to be made. Because otherwise, then the services come up quickly and they surprise people. And then people oftentimes are very reactive to them. And I think that's what we see in a lot of our faith communities when there's like a conflict of some kind.
Yeah. So we just talked about, I think the importance is what we're dealing with our society, with everything is things seem to be very polarized, right?
Hmm.
And also even could be like very black and white.
Hmm.
It's kind of like you're either for it or and there it's like
Right.
how do you be a little bit more, in the middle? It's like be open-minded and what I love about this book because at the end of the chapter you have a section for questions for people to really ponder and
Mhm.
it's like so it's very practical. I think it was the first chapter. The last part was preparing for communal practices of reconciliation, and it's talking about how do you know if your community is ready to engage in practice of reconciliation. I think that's also very important as leaders. Sometimes we want to force an issue because we want to get it done because
Right.
we can't
Yes.
stand this anymore. We just
Yeah.
can't, right? And yet I love the fact that you're like preparing and with the notion of are you really ready to do this kind of work?
Hmm.
And so I wonder for you, like if they're not ready, then what would you have done if you feel like, well, really, I'm like 10 step ahead of everybody here. Um, But is there a certain thing that you think or you can prepare the leaders for during that liminal time where we're like, we should be doing this, yet they're not ready? So,
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in those circumstances, I would probably lean into strengthening relationships as much as possible.
mm,
So it may be that a particular community, let's say they've had some kind of intense conflict in their recent past, they just may not be ready to do the truth telling about it, right? Like to talk about
mm,
what happened. Because there is a fine line, I talk about this a little bit in the book, between talking about what happened in a way that's healing and having people kind of rehearse things in a way that just re-traumatizes everybody.
mm,
And so, leaders have to be really adept at sort of thinking through like where are we on that spectrum? And if it doesn't feel like that's going to be helpful, then it might be a time for the leaders and others in the congregation to maybe just try to work with individuals who need to talk about those things rather than the group. And again, sort of leaning into strengthening the community bonds. So that might be a time to actually focus in on what are the things that hold us together? What
mm,
are the things that we remember fondly,
mm,
that are part of our identity? At one point in the book, I talk about this idea of sparkling events. So it's like inviting a group to remember the things that have really been high points in their life together. That can be really helpful, especially for a community that's been through something really tough, like maybe it's a church split or something like that.
mhm, mhm,
And it's a good way of kind of helping them to heal by saying, okay, let's reflect back on the times when we really felt strong in our identity and we really felt God's presence with us. Okay, so what were the things that we were doing then? How can we feel that now? What are the things that we feel led to do now to lean into that identity?
right.
Um, so I think those are the kinds of things maybe that for some communities could work well. Because I do think, I mean, to Sean's point earlier about the polarization and feeling like you want to avoid people because you don't want to get into conflict. Um, I mean, I think most of us as humans are pretty conflict averse. I mean, you occasionally run into somebody who seems to love conflict and thrive on it, but I think those are the exceptions, not the rule. So I try to think about what are the relationships in my life where, granted, I still don't feel comfortable being in conflict, but where I feel more calm and less anxious dealing with something that is like a disagreement or a problem. And of course, for me, those are the relationships where feel like I have a lot of trust and
Mm,
support. And so I feel like communities would do well to kind of try to build that. If it feels like the community is too fragile to kind of work on this directly,
mm,
maybe it's a time to work on strengthening that support, that trust among members, because it's much easier to navigate differences if we feel like we can trust that the other person's going to respect us and is
mm,
going to honor our dignity as a human being and that sort of thing. I think that's really what's going on in our society right now is there's very little of that, right? So people just say things, lash out, describe each other in very dehumanizing ways. And so, of course, people don't want to engage in that. I mean, that
Yeah.
doesn't sound attractive at all. So, yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
Well, you kind of write that congregational healing is your subtitle as pastoral
hmm
care. What
hmm
oftentimes we're like, ooh, pastor, and how is this? Especially someone that's gone through the ordination process, all the one
Right.
probably pastoral care class that you took in
Yeah.
seminary. That
One.
certainly
Yeah.
was that one class that we took in seminary. That
Yeah.
you're like, how am I supposed to do this? What's the difference you see between the work of reconciliation and pastoral care?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think most people do think of pastoral care, especially people who've been to seminary, I think, tend to think of it as kind of the one-on-one relationships where you talk with people about their problems, right? Like if somebody's struggling with addiction or grief or trauma or something. And of course, one-on-one care from an ordained leader is absolutely pastoral care. I mean, that definitely is part of it. But I happen to think, and really the whole field that I study in thinks about pastoral care differently. We think about pastoral care as a more expansive term, as just care that's given in the faith community, maybe by an ordained leader, but maybe not. And at least within my theological tradition, that care is not reserved for ordained leaders only. It's really the work of the whole people of God. So that allows you to kind of move beyond the one-on-one model to think about, okay, well, what does communal care look like, both for and by the community? Also, another way that I talk about pastoral care in the book, and this is not my own idea, this is lots of writers over many decades have talked about this, but it's not that one person's job in the congregation is to do pastoral care. It's really everyone's job to do that for each other, and that there is a caring dimension of all aspects of ministry. So whether you are officiating a funeral as a pastor, or if you're a lay leader facilitating a heated meeting, there are pastoral care dimensions to both of those things and everything in between. So the idea there is like everything we do in ministry, whether as an ordained or a lay person, um, has a pastoral caring dimension. And I think we can all think of times when we've heard a sermon that felt like pastoral care. And we can also think of times when we heard a sermon that did not feel particularly caring, right? Or we've been in meetings that did not feel like they were led with much care versus
Mhm.
ones that were. So that's another important way of thinking about pastoral care that's different than sort of the one-on-one piece. I mean, the one-on-one dimension of pastoral care, I think in many people's imagination is very much shaped by the therapeutic tradition,
Yeah.
which there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very important resource, and many pastors do have some extensive training and counseling skills, and that's great. But that's not all that pastoral care is, at least not the way that I'm presenting it in the book.
Yeah,
That's
and
great. Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
You go for it.
No, I was trying to reflect a little bit of my theological seminary training and all that. And I wonder, did we ever get any classes on conflict management? Maybe
Mm,
one. And it's kind of included in where a
right,
subgroup of certain things, right?
right.
Where
Hmm.
again, I feel like we're not preparing our people enough to go into the real world.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was a lot of, and I'm discovering now as what we call the mid-council leaders, we work directly more with the pastors than
Mhm.
like individual congregants. But
Right.
then I'm feeling like they're oftentimes our pastor just like, well, what do I do? I can see the conflict bubbling, but the toolbox is so empty that I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, and I'm like, I certainly hope the future for a seminarian there will be more opportunity to learn about like real cases.
Hmm.
We know, but sometimes we kind of roll our eyes. It's like, oh, that's just the way it is, and you learn to deal with it. And actually,
Right.
there's a lot of things that can be done. Um,
Sure.
and yeah, so that's really what Sean and I, we really want to share all this story with people and
Hmm.
let them know there are resources out there, a lot of them. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That whole idea of pastoral care, like just when we say pastoral care, we're like, okay, that's the ordained person's job, not
Hmm.
not the ordinary congregation level.
Hmm.
And you're like,
Mhm.
that when you talked about that, I was like, wow, that
Hmm.
yes, it isn't the paid professional
Hmm.
that has all this duties, but how do we do this
Right.
communally?
Yeah.
Because when there's a problem, it's like, okay, let's send a deacon to bring them meals. You know what I mean?
Right.
Pastor will come
Right.
visit, and that's probably the extended friends will call, write letters, or whatever it might be.
Right.
But how do we, as a congregation, care for one
Yeah.
another, let alone outside? And so that whole
Yeah.
idea that it isn't this one-on-one therapeutic way, that
Right.
that that is in my head of like I've been doing this for a long time. Like, oh, we don't do that.
Yeah. Right. I mean, and I hear this a lot from students, because they come from congregations. Many of them are even leading congregations already when they come to seminary. And many of them really struggle to identify like what is the structure that we have in place to help people care for each other in our congregation. And often they feel like there isn't much of one. And I do think people get tripped up on the phrase pastoral care because they
Yeah.
think it
Mhm.
means the
Mhm.
pastor is supposed to do all that. Whereas, of course, in the field, pastoral in this context means the shepherding function. So it's really just about accompanying people. It's not
Mhm.
about who is doing it. It's more about what is the work of pastoral care, which is accompanying people through all the many changes of life. And I will just put in a plug for one of my colleagues' books. He just published it last year, and I used it for the first time in my intro class this fall. It's called Spiritual Care First Aid by Cody Sanders. And
Okay.
it is a wonderful book. I think the subtitle is An All Hands Approach to Pastoral
Mm.
Care or to Care in Community, something like that. And it really is a book that is focusing on how do we help communities care for each other. And it's wonderfully practical. It has some material in the very back about like how to start a pastoral care ministry in your community. And he's basically saying start with some really easy, like low-hanging fruit, like meal ministry, right? Like
Yeah.
helping
Mm.
people organize to take meals to people. A lot of churches already have that. But what they may not have is a way to kind of coach people or train them a little bit about how to then engage in caring conversations, when they go to drop off the casserole. Um, or, medical accompaniment is
Yeah.
another idea he suggests. People who can volunteer to take folks to their appointments or sit with them in waiting rooms and things like that, which seems maybe like not that big of a thing to do, but it's really, really meaningful. And again, if you can help people gain some confidence and comfort with being present to others, that can be really helpful. So not every person in a congregation is going to feel like, oh, I can go sit by a, dying member's bedside. Like that's not for everyone. But a lot of people would feel like, yeah, I could take a meal to someone and talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes to see how they're doing. Like I could handle that. So, we don't want to present it as a like a either or. Either you do nothing or you're like, this very well-trained pastoral care volunteer. But I think there's a lot of things in between there that can be really, really helpful. And it also helps the pastoral staff not be quite as overwhelmed, with all the needs that are being expressed.
I also think that, especially in today's age, we're finding tough finding pastors in places that
Oh, sure.
there's more and more congregations that are pastorless or that are
Hmm.
lay led or pulpit supply comes in
Right,
on Sunday to preach, that it becomes
right.
more on the congregation that these resources
Hmm.
are great. Like just because you're a smaller congregation that doesn't have a pastor doesn't mean there's lack of conflict at all. So how
Sure.
how
Of
do we how
course.
do we do pastoral care? How do we work through? And I think it's an every person thing as opposed to
Yeah,
the ordained clergy, especially when you have congregations without full-time pastors,
right,
part-time, there's pulpit supply, there's the
right.
yoke pastor model
Yeah,
that you
right.
don't have that full-time professional clergy
Sure.
to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I actually did provide at the very back of the book, one of the appendices, is a piece that I call levels of practice. So like I try to break down some of the practices I suggest in the book, some of the examples, and say like, okay, here's a list of things that most people could do on their own without any special training. Okay, then here's a level that you might need a leader with some special training. So in some congregations, that would be maybe a member of the pastoral staff or some other leader. And then there's a third level that's like, this is where you need to call in a professional, like
Yeah.
maybe it's a consultant. Like if there's a really, really intense conflict going on, for example, even most ordained pastors are probably not going to be equipped to deal with that on their
Hmm.
own.
Hmm.
So there's just some suggestions there for communities to think about, okay, what could we actually do now to work on some of these things? And then maybe there's some other things that we need a little bit of training for. Like maybe we want to look 6 months down the road and say, let's get a little bit of communication skills training or boundary training or something to help us to prepare. So that goes back to your question, Francis, about maybe we're not ready to do this yet. Maybe what we need is a little bit of coaching and training in some particular areas to help us get to the place where we could have
Hmm.
conversations where we could be healthy and constructive and not, harming each other with the way we're talking to each other and stuff like that. Which I know seems like, should be a low bar for people to be able to do. But when people are upset or dealing with a lot of grief and loss or a lot of uncertainty, um, most of us go back to a lower level of functioning, right? We don't always bring our best selves. And so a little bit of training or coaching can maybe go a long way with these things. And so that's something that leaders can also ponder. Like, is there something we could bring in? Maybe it's just for the session, or
Hmm.
maybe it's for the whole congregation, depending on the situation.
So, how are you hoping congregation and their leaders will use this book?
Well, I think a lot goes to what we've just been talking about, which is to think about first, where are the places in our communal life where we might need to do some reconciling work? And I hope that churches and their leaders will really think about that question of, how ready are we to do this work? And kind of make preparation for that if they don't feel ready right away. But then to really engage it and to work to institute some of these practices. And I'm not saying it's easy because I've been a pastor. I know how busy church life can be. I know how hard it is to schedule things. And a lot of these practices I'm suggesting in this book take time. They're not things that can just be accomplished overnight. So I'm not putting that out there to say like, oh, this is just an easy 1, 2, 3, step manual and you're done. Um, but I think if congregations can look through here and find little pieces of things that they could implement, things that make sense in their context, because again, it's not a one size fits all type of a thing, but I think it could really make a difference. I mean, even just very small things like including some times in worship to name certain things or to have a time of lament or, whatever the situation may be. Those might be very simple things to start with. Maybe even some, simple rituals to kind of symbolize certain things that the congregation might be coping with. I do provide also in the back of the book um, a litany for congregations to use if they're deciding to embark on some reconciling work together. So that's one way of kind of naming in worship, this is what we're doing, so that people have a sense of like, oh, this isn't just something that was sprung on us and we have no idea what's happening, but it's actually a way for the congregation to affirm, like, yes, this is
Yeah.
what we want to do together, and we're asking God's blessing on us while we do it. And I think all of that is important for it to feel like the different parts of a congregation's life are reflected in different places, right? Including worship,
Mhm.
because that is the place where we're usually all together in a congregation, right, on a regular basis. So I think it is important to name those things, but then also find ways outside of worship, whether it's small group settings or, it could be a whole congregational meeting depending on what the situation is, but ways to do these things, tell the truth, grieve and lament and confess and repent and then bless each other. The releasing part, I hope most congregations won't have to think about that, about releasing each other from their relationships, but sometimes that is the case.
Mm.
Sometimes people discern that, we really can't stay together. And I think if we were going to do that, it would be better to do it in a thoughtful way that uses practices of discernment rather than the way churches usually do it, which is just to get reactive and mad and then people leave, which is really, damaging and hurtful. I know that not every situation will allow for that kind of a thing. But as you said, Francis, that could even be something useful for people to ponder in their personal relationships.
Mhm.
Maybe I need to release this relationship with this one individual because maybe there's just been too much damage or we just can't see our way forward.
Yeah.
And there are some practices in there that you could use as an individual too. So it could be helpful just even in people's personal lives.
Yeah. I think that's so helpful and even permission giving, right? Because
Yeah,
oftentimes we feel like no, oh no, we can't do that. And
right.
you kind of like, yeah, I know this is really dysfunctional. I know this is not healthy, but oh no, we cannot break apart. And then sometimes
Right,
you wonder, well, is that healthy, right? So like
right.
so
And yeah,
I
that
mean,
takes a lot of discernment. I mean,
right.
and I mean, in my denomination, the United Church of Christ, we actually have an order of worship in our book of worship for the recognition of the end of a marriage.
Mm.
And I mean, I don't think a lot of people use it because, again, I don't know that a lot of couples are in a place where they can use it. But it's actually really beautiful service because it's about honoring what has been and then releasing each other from your covenant promises. And I think that congregations could use that too. Like if they decide that they can't stay together, there is a way of liturgically naming that and telling the truth about it, naming the grief and the loss and the hurt of it, but also trying to bless each other on your way, even though our paths are going to diverge now. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. If we could ever, find a way to stay with that process of discernment long enough, to get
Right.
to that point. And I admit that's a hard thing for most communities to do, but
Yeah, I don't think we have a liturgy for that. Do
I don't,
we, Sean?
not that I'm aware of.
I'm intrigued.
yeah,
So
it's
I'm gonna
I've
ask
never
you to send
actually
it to me.
officiated one, but it
Really?
is there. It is
Oh
there.
wow.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. Well, lastly, I think let's talk a little bit about your writing process.
Sure.
So you have a few books now, right? And
A
I
couple.
just, it's daunting to think about writing. And I don't know
Yeah.
how long it took you for this book. I know you had a sabbatical, but
Hmm.
I think that it's because when we started this process, Sean and I actually talked about multiple things. We're like, oh, do we want to write a book together? And
Hmm.
it took us like, what, 2 weeks? And we're like, nah. We actually put together something, but it was
Yeah.
like, oh my
Yeah.
good Lord, right? And
Yeah.
so I would just, not that we both are done with writing, but
Sure.
I was just wondering if maybe there could be some inspiration for future writers.
Yeah. So, I'll just share a couple things. One is, I think, at least for me, I can't speak for anyone else, the task of writing a book takes a lot longer than people think. Not just the writing of it, but just getting the ideas
Mm.
in your mind and figuring out what you want to do. I actually had my first sabbatical in the academic year 2019-20, which of course was curtailed by the pandemic. But when I was starting out, I was doing all this research about reconciliation. And like I said, I kind of thought of it at that time as more of an academic type of book, for other scholars. But over time, and again, it took months for me to kind of come to this. I started thinking like, I'm not sure if that's the right direction. So I had to really sit with that for a period of time. Of course, the pandemic came. Then I served as interim dean of my school, so I really wasn't having a lot of time to think about writing. But during that period, I was invited to give a lecture for my installation into my named chair here at PTS. And so that actually gave me the impetus to say, okay, like what do I really want to say about this? Because I've been kind of mulling over these ideas about reconciliation for months and months now. And so when I gave that lecture, I think it was in the fall of 2022, I put out these ideas of these communal practices. Like that's where I kind of landed. But again, it wasn't like I just thought them up. I had been thinking about these for a long time. So after that, I gave that lecture. I went down to the reception afterward, and my colleague Scott Hagley said, I think that lecture could be a book. And I was like, really? He was like, yeah, like you've already got the outline of it and everything. So, one thing that I would say is part of what I think helps sustain a person in writing is encouragement from other people, like to say, hey, that's a
Mm.
good idea. Like, have you thought about this? So I thought, okay, and so soon after that, I finished my tenure as dean, and I thought, okay, I'm ready to work on this again. And again, it took a long time just to kind of get my ideas together. But I would say the biggest thing for me in growing as a writer and sustaining the work that it takes to create a book is a regular practice. So we talk a lot about spiritual disciplines, right? That we all need to be having regular practices that sustain us in ministry, whether it's prayer, reading scripture, Bible study with others, um, personal reflection, going for spiritual direction, whatever the things are that sustain us. Well, writing is the same, I think. That if you try to do it all in like 1 or 2 days, it's not going to go very well. Whereas if you have a very regular rhythm of just sitting down and writing, um, you'd be amazed what you can produce over a period of months. And one thing that's helped me so much with this is a group that I go to called the Writing Table. It was founded by a colleague of mine from Vanderbilt, Eileen Campbell Reed, and it's just a group of people who come together on Zoom every day in the morning for 1 hour, and we write in community. But I mean, nobody's talking, nobody's got their camera on. We just all know that we're writing for 1 hour, and we actually do it in two 25-minute segments. And then at the end of that time, we share our strategies. What was working for you today? What were your roadblocks today? And sometimes it's just people say, my strategy was to show up, and I came and I didn't get as much done as I wanted, but I got more done than if I didn't come. So
Mhm.
I've been going to the writing table regularly, probably since January of 2024, I think,
Oh,
maybe even
wow.
before that. And I don't go every day. My schedule doesn't allow for that. But I go usually at least a couple times a week and sometimes more if I'm trying to get a project finished. And it's really wild how much more writing I can get done if I just have a very clear kind of goal for that hour
Yeah.
and just focus on that. And then at the end of the writing table, we also take 90 seconds to what we call leave ourselves breadcrumbs. So it's like a note to myself, what am I going to do tomorrow or the next time I
Mm.
pick up this project? So writing in community, I think, is a big one, and writing regularly because I mean, in grad school, I wrote a lot of things like in an intense period of time, like over, a week or something. And sometimes that's just the way life is in grad
Right.
school. But it's probably not the best writing that you can do, when you're under pressure and doing it in a very short period. Whereas I think good writing takes more time, or the best writing maybe takes more time. And it also requires you to go through multiple iterations. So writing a book,
Mhm.
you write the manuscript, but then you get feedback from your editor and you go back and revise. And um, this is what students, of course, are annoyed about, right? When I make comments on their paper, because it's like, yeah, this is good, and you can make it better this way,
Mhm. Mhm.
but that's my job. That's my job to help people do the best work they can do. And so that's one way of thinking about that. But it's really hard, I would say, for most people as writers to receive feedback because
Mhm.
it feels like criticism often.
Yeah.
But if you can be open to it and receive it in the spirit in which it's given, you can see over a period of time how much better your piece becomes when you invite others to help you with it, if you want to put it that way.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I would say that's kind of how I've tried to grow as a writer from kind of binge writing, I might call it, in the past
Yeah.
to a more regular practice, and I found it very helpful personally.
That's awesome. I think we do have one or two more questions for
Sure, yeah.
you. Um, so, as an educator, as
Hmm.
someone who is training and trying to nurture the next
Hmm.
generations of pastors, seminarians, or even academics, what is your hope for the next generation?
Mm, that's a really, really good question. I think my hope is for them to have the resources and the training they need to become leaders who are grounded, who have good, sustainable practices of self-care and boundary setting. Because I feel like my generation of ministers, I feel like we have wrestled with that. And I
Hmm.
feel like the models that many of us had in ministry, people who were a generation ahead of us, did not model that very well. Like the generation ahead of me, I think was more like, the church is your life and, you
Yeah.
give everything to it.
Right.
Um, so I think my generation, people who are my peers, like we've been trying to find healthier models, but it has been a struggle at times. So my hope for people who are coming into ministry now is that they would see these practices of self-care, spiritual discipline, boundary setting, having a rich and full life that is not solely defined by your pastoral work. I feel like that if they can have that from the beginning, that will be really helpful to them. I also do hope that they will feel like they get the training and the resources they need to equip them for these kinds of issues. And I mean, it's one thing to have a class on leadership through conflict, which I do offer an elective in that. It's not a requirement, but I can always, I'm still going to advocate for it being a requirement. Um,
I
but
would.
yeah, um, but I also think it's about not just the content that we provide seminarians, but the spiritual formation and like the personal and professional
Mhm.
formation that we provide. Because a lot of what I believe is most important about leadership through conflict, and a lot of what we focus on in that class actually, is more about knowing oneself and developing one's own sort of inner resources. Um, for being less anxious, for being able to stay connected with people across difference, for being non-reactive or less reactive, maybe we could put it that way. And just for having that sense of kind of rootedness and groundedness, to where we don't have to feel hooked by other people's, anxiety or emotions all the time, which is it can be really hard to do. And that's not something I can just tell somebody, here's how you do it, and they just do it. It's like a lifelong process of maturation.
Yeah.
In family systems language, we would probably call it differentiation, self-differentiation, like learning how to be a fully developed self, but also in connection and in relationship with others.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important to have both, right? So we're not just doing what other people want all the time because we're trying to make them happy. I think many people in ministry, myself included, come from family backgrounds where we were, rewarded for taking care of other people, and we want to please people and we want to be liked.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very human thing to want to be liked and to make other people happy. But I think we all know as leaders that can't be our only goal, because many times the tasks of leadership are to make decisions and to do things that some people will be unhappy with. So like having that confidence as a fully developed self to say, like, I understand the things that people are telling me. I hear their objections. I hear their concerns. I've taken those into account. I've taken them seriously. And I still feel like this is the best path. And if it's my job in a particular situation to make that call, I need to be able to do that, feeling like I have done the proper work of discernment and self-reflection, and really taking seriously what other people are saying. I mean, that's very different than like, well, I'm the leader and it's my job and it doesn't really
Right.
matter what you say. That's a very different posture than I've heard you, and also I think I need to make a different decision here, which again I feel like is a process of maturation and self-reflection that takes time. It's not something we can just tell people how to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this time with us. We're not going to let
Thank
you go
you.
because Sean's going to ask a question that we ask all the people who come
Okay,
on.
awesome.
What is your comfort food when
Oh,
it is one of those days? What is your comfort food?
oh goodness, I have to choose only one.
Oh, no, no, no. You tell us how
It could
I
even be
call
a
it a
cuisine.
favorite. If you have a
Uh,
favorite.
yeah. Oh, wow, that's a really good question. I think like I have kind of two. One is more like, you know, main course savory kind of food, and one is sweet. But I really love pasta dishes. So like spaghetti, lasagna, anything like that, I feel like is just, I don't know. There's a hominess to it that just always feels like comforting. It may also be because in our house, my son loves spaghetti meatballs, so we have that like at least once a week usually.
Right.
So it's probably I associate it with, positive things. But then really almost any kind of dessert, honestly, but I would say probably ice cream is my choice
Mm.
for sweet comfort food.
What
Yeah.
flavor though? There's tons of
I know many flavors that I love, but the two that come to mind are anything peanut butter and chocolate,
mm,
or I also love coffee ice cream with like chocolate in it or something. Yeah.
Mm.
mm.
Now I'm gonna go get ice cream.
I know. I know it's
And
only like
pasta.
9:30 in the morning there, but
And pasta.
anytime's a good time for ice cream.
Yeah.